There you go. Anyways, we're close. If you have a cell phone, if you could turn it off, we'd appreciate that, or put it in a silent mode. And if you'd like to talk on an item either on the agenda or not on the agenda, this young lady up to my left will be happy to take your slip and give you your 3 minutes. With that, if we could all rise. Richard, you want to take it?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Where you going? Okay, could we get a roll call, please?
Chair Algauer,
Here.
Vice Chair Hicks, Commissioner Beck,
Here.
Commissioner Chester,
Here.
Commissioner Higginson,
Here.
Commissioner Snodgrass,
Here.
and Commissioner Vick.
Here.
Thank you.
The consent agenda. Can I get approval of that, which is the minutes?
Five Winds Ranch representative?
Huh?
The Five Winds Ranch representative, we need to nominate the committee.
Oh, yeah, we'll get to that. Okay, anybody have, I get approval for the consent agenda?
I approve.
Thank you. We got a motion, we got approval.
I'll second.
Thank you. Anybody disagree or any changes? Hearing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. Takes care of housekeeping. Okay, well, the establishment of the Five Winds Ranch, you want to do that now, or?
We have that as a outstanding item. We have as part of one of the city's committees is the Five Winds Ranch committee. It does involve a member of the Planning Commission, and so as part of that roster, we're here just to see if anyone's interested in serving in that role. I don't know what the meeting schedule is or when a future meeting is, but really just wanted to make sure that we had that on the books. That way, whenever that meeting, if it does come to fruition as part of the Five Winds Ranch, we had someone online.
I'd like to nominate Stacy Chester.
Okay.
I would support that.
It's what, so we got a nomination, we got a second?
Yes.
Oh, we got a second, okay. Any others? Seeing, hearing none, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Well, you got it. Be careful what you ask for. And remember who did it.
Again.
Payback. Okay, let's move in. Any public comments?
We do have two public speaker slips for items not on the agenda, and so Maria will call the first one and the second one.
Okay.
First, we have Terry Boone.
Hello, I'm Terry Boone. I live at Yucaipa Ridge Road in Yucaipa. And two things I want to comment on tonight. First of all, City Council was pretty much a crap show Monday night. And most of us in the city do not want to fight with Planning Commission or City Council. We're trying to work together with you. So with that being said, I want to let you know that there are ways we can work around the plans for everything. What we really want is for the Planning Commission and the City Council to stick with the general plan. The second thing I wanted to say is Ms. Chester at the last Planning Commission said that isn't a document a living document. There's no, I'm a doctor, I was a biochemist. The only thing that's living is nature, people, mammals and things like that. Documents are not living. They're sets of rules to just set a standard for a civil society. The Bible is not a living document. The Constitution is not a living document. And the general plan is not a living document. There can be wiggle room if we want to discuss it all together as citizens of the city and the planning and commission and the city council, but it is not to just change at the whim. We do not want greed to lead our plans for this city. I personally had a very high-end developer come out and look at the Serrano Estates project. He walked the land, he looked at the plans, he calculated developing 22 one-acre estates up there, and he said that even with that development, which is the only amount of land that's developable, if you take off the hills, the earthquake trenches, and the pretty much riverbed that goes through it, that after all expenses, there would still be a net of $7 million profit. So with all of these plans that are coming through, the developers, the owners can still make a profit without raping the city. And that's all I want to say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The time is your job.
Holy crap, I didn't know that.
You're fired.
Good, here.
You got it figured out?
No, I don't know how to
Okay.
use it. It's never been my job. Where's Tony?
We can do a tutorial on the timer.
Yes, we do.
are keeping track on the recordation.
Don't we have timers on our watch?
I realize that you're new in that hot seat, so.
Okay, is there an on and off button we're missing? There you go. Okay,
Okay,
go.
we're ready.
Next, we have Hanson Wang.
Start.
Good evening, Planning Commission. Thank you very much for starting out this year, and hopefully we'll be able to work together to continue making Yucaipa the great city that it is. I'm going to try and make this short enough so that you won't have to use that timer that you were talking about. Looking at the general plan, I think if I'm correct, it's for 20 years, and we're down the path on that. And it seems like it's done the city good. We've progressed. It's a city that other people want to come to live in, and we've had comments from multiple other areas about why people should live in Yucaipa. So I would suggest that as much as we can, that we stick to the general plan and that make minor adjustments as needed to accommodate modern building and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that it, Ben?
That's it for the public comments, not on the agenda.
Okay. With that, let's just move to our first item on the agenda. That's case
Chair?
number.
Before you get started, for a very obvious reason, since the property is mine, I need to recuse myself from this agenda item. So the next training session for the timer.
We have to shut down. We have an operator.
I'll keep track on my watch here.
I can do it. Watch. Okay, with that, continue. Case number 22-149, special use permit and architectural review.
Thank you, Honorable Chair Al Gower. Today I bring before you case number 22-149, a special use permit for the architectural review of a 2,400 square foot, 22-foot tall detached metal building on a rural living property located at 10345 Walnut Grove Court. The applicants are Ray and Donna Snodgrass. The site is located on a 1.37 acre parcel within, like I said, the rural living land use district with a 1 acre minimum lot size, further within the custom home overlay, which has its unique setbacks and custom home requirements. The site is surrounded by single-family properties to the southeast and west with a with a rural living vacant parcel to the north. The detached structure is proposed to store equipment for the on-site wine cultivation and to store the applicant's personal belongings. Here we have a site plan that shows that the site is currently improved with a 4,200 square foot home, with the proposed metal building being 2,400 square feet and located to the rear of that home and is 22 feet tall, which is shorter than the primary structure. The proposed garage fits within all rural living and custom home overlay setbacks and is located, again, behind that main residence. You can see the site plan there. The elevations are looking to emulate a traditional barn or agrarian style elevation with a 22-foot tall gabled roof, 2 roll-up doors, and an access door on the south elevation, to be painted barn door red with charcoal roof and white doors. Because of the visibility along Bryant Street, which is within a high visibility or a scenic corridor, thank you, Ben. The Planning Commission may recommend additional elements to be along the rear portion, which is going to be visible from Bryant, and could also look into a green screen. The applicant noted that they are working with the installer to add some of these additional trim details to the rear elevation, which you can see here is unadorned currently. As a part of the project, notices were sent to all adjacent property owners, and 3 responses were received, including 1 phone call and 2 written responses. 2 of the commenters had concerns that the project would lead to commercial uses and impact on the neighborhood, but staff confirmed that the conditions of approval for this project do not authorize commercial uses at the site. And one of the written responses, which was included as a part of the submittal of your packets, additionally commented that the view shed and aesthetic of the neighborhood would be negatively affected as with an approval of this project. One other written response was received following the packets that you guys received, so you have a separate paper in front of you today, in support of the proposed project, indicating that the structure is similar to other metal structures that are within the area. So here are some of the site photos. To the left of the screen, you can see the existing property, and to the right of the screen, you can see that view from Bryant with the vineyards kind of to the forefront of the photo, and then that kind of hilly area in the back. That's where the proposed structure would be, which is why we brought in some of those recommendations for an additional condition to either screen or add architectural elements to the rear portion. Therefore, it is staff's recommendation that you review the architectural design, adopt the special use permit findings, adopt a categorical exemption, class 3, and direct staff to file a notice of exemption. If you guys have any questions, staff would be happy to respond, or the applicant's representative is here as well.
Okay, thank you, Christian. As always, very good report. Okay, with that, did the applicant like to step forth and say a few words?
Just a few words. Thank you, Honorable Chairman, Planning Commissioners. I hope you all stayed warm. It was fun seeing all the snow out there today. My name is Travis Heaps. I'm with West Coast Entitlement. The applicants, Ray and Donna Snodgrass, have been wanting to construct a metal building for some time now, and they are excited to bring this project forward. The Snodgrasses have lived in their home since 1996 and have been steadily improving the property since. Over the last few years, they began taking a strong interest in viticulture and even began growing their own grapes. Their vineyard has become a large part of their lives and has significantly beautified the property, enhancing the rural theme. With all the grape growing, the applicant's need for storage has grown, and now they are proposing a metal building to be used to support that existing vineyard on site. The building has been designed with a specific color scheme to further encourage the agrarian nature of the property. As Mr. Farmer mentioned earlier, there was one written comment, and I would like to address some of the points that were made in that letter. First, the building will not be a blight on the neighborhood. The building will be built with durable, long-lasting materials and will be aesthetically pleasing. The property owners take pride in their home and their property, and this new building will only further improve their property. There are, as far as views go, there are no protections from the development code or the general plan regarding views. But aside from that, the building is 22 feet tall at its peak and 17 feet on its sides, which is no larger than a typical single-family residence. And so while views should not be considered in reviewing this project, a building of this size will hardly impede the view of the San Bernardino Mountains. Additionally, there will be no commercial activity on site, and the conditions of approval reinforce that. The construction of this metal agricultural building will not impede any neighbor's ability to use the property or disrupt the existing land use pattern. The crop cultivation is an existing use that is already in operation, and the proposed building is intended to support that use. The proposed building will not generate any additional activity on the property than what is currently there. No additional traffic will be generated. No additional noise will be generated. This building will be used solely for the storage of equipment and vehicles they use for maintaining the property. The proposed metal building will be smaller than the single-family residence, is located at the back corner of the property, and it will be accessory to the single-family residence in size and appearance. And while the house is not red, the red emphasizes the appearance of a barn, which fits within the agrarian theme of the property that they're trying to go for. Also, there are a number of similar buildings that are scattered throughout the North Bench. You guys have approved a number of them. And so these buildings throughout the North Bench creates a pattern of development in the area to which that this proposed building will be compatible with. And lastly, on the comment, whether the applicant is on a committee or the Yucaipa Valley Wine Alliance, that should have no bearing on the decision of the Planning Commission to approve this project. The Snodgrass family are residents of the city just like you or I, and they're entitled to a fair process just like everyone else. The Snodgrass family should not be penalized for being upstanding citizens who take an active part in this community. And then in the staff report, it mentioned how there were some discussions with the applicant about the possibility of installing a greenbelt or adding architectural elements to the building. However, I do not believe that this is necessary.
Let me ask you then, when you were referring to some kind of architectural, are you talking about possibly trees or plants around it?
Well, so there's two things that were mentioned. One was some type of tack-on feature that could be added to the building or some type of landscape screening. So as far as the landscape screening, there is a dense vineyard that runs between the building and the right-of-way. And these vines grow upwards of 6 to 7 feet tall. Plus, there is over 150 feet from the building to the right-of-way, which should help soften the building from Bryant Street. Installing any trees or shrubs could have negative impacts on the existing vineyard, whether it be root systems that disrupt the vines, or if you have shade that's being cast down from any trees. And by creating issues with the vines, it's counterintuitive to the goal of this building, which is to support the grape growing. Also, there is no water line that runs to that portion of the property. All of the vines utilize a drip system that they run off of, and that drip system can only be utilized for the grapes. So really requiring additional landscaping or a green belt would really just create a costly improvement for little value. And then if you go to Oleander. And so this is just an example of a building that's in the North Bench. This is off of Oleander. This was approved by the Planning Commission. I'm not sure of the date exactly. But as you can see, it's of similar size. It's 20 feet from the property line. And the only screening that is there is the chain link fence with vinyl slats, which is transparent. And then on 15th Street, another project that came to Planning Commission, as you can see that when you view the property, that's all you see is the red metal barn. No screening, no single-family residence not located behind, and this was approved. And then as far as the tack-on additions, this building will be ordered from a metal manufacturer who specializes in steel buildings. When ordering a building from one of these companies, they essentially offer a shell of a building and you get the option to choose your colors and the door locations and sometimes the roof dimensions. But there are no options for adding additional trim or adding additional tack-on features, and everything comes pre-engineered. So anything added to the building beyond what is being proposed today would have to be constructed and installed by a third party, and they would require a separate set of engineered plans, which can become costly when you're trying to create something custom, like some type of faux tack-on. Tack-on additions would also not be created from the same material, from the same treated material, so it is reasonable to assume that the tack-on features may not be as durable as the rest of the building. The material may have a different texture or appearance than the rest of the barn, which in my opinion would be disingenuous to the intended design of the building. And then here's an example on Douglas Street. This is another one that was approved, 20 feet from the side property line. They were required to do they added the faux shutters on there. If you can go to the next one. But as you look closer, you see that the colors don't quite match. It was intended that this brown was supposed to be the same as this brown, but doesn't quite match. It's not of the same treated material. And then there's beginning to show discoloration and wear from the elements. So to kind of close it out, it is our opinion that the building as proposed is compatible with the character of the property and the surrounding community, and that there is no need for additional screening or tack-on features beyond what is already being proposed. And the property owner is available for any questions if you have, and I'm also available as well.
Go ahead, Richard.
The barn door red, what is that? I know there's an old barn right down the street, across the street from there, and it's an old rustic red. Is that, it's not gonna be like a somewhat of a fire engine red, or it's gonna look rustic, right?
Yes, that's the intended goal of it. They have color palettes that you choose from. I don't think fire truck red is on there, but it's specific as barn door red.
Okay.
Anyone else have anything for?
Yeah, I have a question. Oh,
Go ahead.
I was just, for future, is there a permit that the applicant can pursue in the future to potentially conduct business in a residential area? I mean, to address the concern of the neighbor.
So right now, what is permitted in the RL land use district would be what is allowed there. Whether or not any changes to the city's development code, whatever uses that may apply at that time would then apply to this site. But there is a condition of approval that reflects that it is whatever uses are allowed within that district and explicitly provided for as what the limits would be for that. So
You want to elaborate?
yeah, and so certainly certain types of uses like automotive repair is not permitted in the residential districts, and so that would not apply to this subject site either.
Say wine sales.
What?
Say wine sales.
That would be a separate discussion as part of a development code amendment that would need to come through, and then they would, whatever permitting process the planning commission and city council established, then would have to apply in this case. So rather than try to presume future uses that have not been vetted by city council, it would just be, if there is that flexibility, then at that time that would be explored under its own separate approval.
Right on.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments on the landscaping and obviously looking at that. That was my first reaction, was to add something to it, because I visited this site and obviously it's a very visible area. Of course, I'm looking at the back of other people's yards that have travel trailers and everything else. So I believe this is kind of conducive to this area. There's a lot of homes that have barns and utility type structures. I also know I've done a lot of metal structures in the past, just in my career. So looking at embellishments or additional elements to a building, it's obviously from a distance, it's off the highway, but adding a louver or something that kind of break up the mass, to me, in my experience, is not tremendously expensive. It may be far cheaper than planting mature trees and running landscaping. So it's just a suggestion, obviously looking at it from a standpoint of making it aesthetically look more like a barn or a little bit more pleasing, especially from the visible corridor of that. I think it's just worth exploring, but it's just my suggestion. Yes.
Ray Snodgrass, I'm co-owner. The very issue you're discussing, I did talk with the manufacturer of the building, or the vendor, and one of the companies that we're looking at erecting the building does a lot of business with Empire, which is the provider of the metal building. And they said they have a lot of pieces and parts left over from other projects. And that while Empire cannot add that kind of facade to a building for aesthetics, because they would have to actually build a door, and they'd have to cut a hole in it, and I have concerns about security and holes, doors that would be non-functional, so to speak. So, but they said they have a lot of materials that may match the construction material of the metal building, and we may be able to work out a deal with them directly, not with the manufacturer, but with the company building the building, to put some kind of trim that would look like a door, but not necessarily be one, or cut a hole in the building. We have not yet determined that that would be the vendor we use to build the building, although we're leaning in that direction because of that reason, that we may be able to work with them to add trim that looks like a functional door, or like one of the haylofts with the doors that close with the X features. And that's what we plan on doing if we use that vendor. And again, we don't have the vendor for construction because we don't have this at that point yet. So that's the intent.
Right. I appreciate that, Ray. And I think I wasn't really referring about doors or security, because obviously if it's sitting out there, I can see that being a concern. I was more looking at, I've done a number of buildings with high louvers, they're just attic type louvers. So anything like that could enhance it. That's just my recommendation.
And that was a discussion that staff had with the property owner, Ray's better half. And she indicated kind of the same thing, that the surplus material that the vendor may have can create kind of like a false kind of barn door kind of effect, so that when you're viewing it from the scenic corridor of Bryant Street, you know, passing by, it's going to look like this kind of functional element that, while in practice isn't necessarily a real door, but something that adds a little bit more pizzazz. And as part of the inspiration for the structure, having that kind of barn rusted feel, that was a decorative element that that if they were able to facilitate it, would look appropriate. And so that was the basis for staff's discussion point on that feature as well, is that may be a beneficial detail for the structure, especially given the visibility.
Well, I'll defer that back to planning Ben. Thank you. Thank you.
Are you good with David?
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else have anything for him, for a few words? I had I guess it's not a big issue, I was just curious. On this map here, the site plan, okay, if you look at the site plan, is that the metal building? When I drove by it, way in the back, am I correct?
In the back,
Yeah,
yes,
okay. Is it 24 feet?
22 feet. It's 22 feet. That's a mistake. It's a mistake on my end, and the site plan says 24
But
feet.
it was a mistake on your.
It was, believe it or not, it happens from time to time, and I'll take full ownership of it. It should say 22 feet on the site plan, and so that's.
Okay, I just wanted to point it out. Thank you.
Appreciate your thorough review.
Okay, do we have any comments?
We do have one public comment, speaker slip.
We have Jim Makovich.
Hi, my name is Jim Makovich. I'm a neighbor of Ray and Donna. I had marked mine as that I was opposed to the project, but this is more informational than it is opposition. I wanted to find out from the commission, is there a time frame that we're, as neighbors, supposed to be notified of this meeting? Are we supposed to be notified within a week of before the meeting, or there is no time frame as to when they notify neighbors of what's going on?
So I can provide a response, but do you want to finish up your comment and then I can provide, that way you have your 3 minutes to
Oh, okay.
to speak, yeah.
Okay. Really, I think the main thing that I think that there's opposition, at least with the other neighbors, was the fact that I don't think they're really opposed to the actual structure going up, but the color of the structure, okay? We only have 7 houses on our cul-de-sac. Every one of them is a very muted light color. They range from tan to a light silver gray and stuff like that. The Snodgrass's home is a light yellow with white trim, okay? So when they talk about that the appearance of this new building should be compatible to the surrounding area, it's not, okay? And as big as the city of Yucaipa is, I think there's only maybe 2 red buildings. They're in the whole city. So to put it in our neighborhood, I'm not opposed to the building, but I think that there are 2 buildings that are similar or being used for the same thing. One is on the opposite corner of where I am, and it was an actual structured building with stucco, and it's painted exactly the same color as the home. There was a house and property with a garage and an ADU, which was on Monterey Pine, which is right behind my property. And when they put that in, the house is white with like a black trim, and the corresponding garage, which is similar in nature to what they want to put up, was painted to match the housing, okay? So I think that, you know, the use of for them to put up the building, I'm not in opposition of, but I think the coloring of it, the fact that people coming down Bryant are gonna see it, because now they're saying they don't want to put up a green screen or anything like that. My fear is that it's gonna be a curiosity standpoint. People coming up and down Bryant, they see this big red building, everybody's, what is that building for? So what are they gonna do? They're gonna turn onto Grape Street, come up Walnut Grove, go to the end, because that's where the Snodgrass's property is at, to say, oh yeah, there's the building, we still don't know what it is. And so basically, they're just gonna be coming up and down
All right.
the
Okay,
cul-de-sac.
well, thank you, sir.
All right?
I appreciate your comments.
Okay, so in terms of the public hearing notice, we are, as part of the notice for the meeting, does require 10 days in advance. So essentially 2 weeks before the meeting, which is obviously on Wednesdays, 2 weeks before we're sending out the notice for that. And then I do want to note as well that we do provide, the public comment has ended, but I can talk with you separately. And then we also do send out a project notice when the project is deemed complete. And so that is a secondary notice that we do in addition to state law.
Okay.
If I could just add one thing, the only notification that I received on this, I haven't received anything from the city. This was taped on my door yesterday afternoon.
Okay, well, you can deal with that with Ben, you know.
I do
Thank
want to, and perhaps maybe as a clarifying element, our special use permit only requires notice to all the adjacent properties. So if he is a couple of houses down, then no notice is required pursuant to the city's municipal code.
Was there anything that the applicant would like to rebuttal?
Thanks again for the opportunity. I do respect our neighbors, and Jim and his wife, we get along quite well. I'm thinking that the original notice didn't go to them because the property is not adjacent. It doesn't touch the property lines. So with all due respect, that the city met its obligation with the original notifications of the project. I kind of disagree with the color description because red is kind of a traditional barn, agricultural barn feature going back many, many years, and mainly because red was a treatment of the wood, and the treatment actually was red in the agricultural industry. So that was to protect the wood, and that was kind of a industry standard to protect then non-metal buildings. Obviously, they were natural products, but they were red. And that's kind of agricultural history. And I don't think it's adverse to the history of the Yucaipa Valley, going back to some features that traditional agricultural shows in the
That's a
history
good,
of the
I mean,
United
there's a lot you can do
agriculture
with,
across the
with the
country.
barn like that, the shutters.
Yeah.
There's a lot that can be done, but I mean,
And I assure you, we will attempt to do that. And I mean, we are not there to put up a big box and expect people to traipse around the neighborhood trying to figure out what it is. If you travel up and down Bryant Street now and look, there are quite a few buildings erected that in my opinion, don't match the colors of agriculture, or they match the existing buildings. But that's, I'm not looking to compare ourselves with that. We want to be good neighbors. We have no intention of any kind of a commercial operation, and we'd have to come back before the commission anyway, as Mr. Matlock said. So, having said that, we always want to be good neighbors. The vines themselves will provide a greenbelt view from Bryant looking towards the neighborhood. And yes, they'll see a red barn, but I don't see that as being offensive, and we certainly wouldn't propose it to impact our neighbors in a negative way. So I just wanted to, I don't want to rebut and get in a big argument over that. Color is important to us. That's why we said red, because it kind of puts us back to the agriculture field.
thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, with that, we'll close the public hearing and we'll move to the commissioners. It's like I always do, I kind of start down at the end down there and put, David, you're on the spot. Any comments?
Well, other than I appreciate the response back from the applicant and also just hearing the comments from that. Obviously, I think it was brought up earlier, there's different shades of red. And so I think obviously looking at that from a standpoint of we're not looking at fire engine red or something that's a little bit more weathered. But again, I understand color is important, and I understand and just appreciate what you're trying to do as a homeowner. And again, this area is it's not littered with those types of buildings, but they're large acres and people need space for their equipment. And if I had a lot that large, I would want a barn too. So I don't have any other questions on that, but I appreciate the response.
Stacy?
I don't have anything to say.
Nothing to say?
Nothing
All
to
right,
say.
Richard?
Nothing to say.
Okay, let's jump down to Lyle. So with that, do I hear some sort of a motion?
I'll make a motion, we approve do I have to give the number of the item?
Okay,
I'll
I get a
second.
I get a second, Lyle? Got a second from Lyle. Any further discussion? Seeing none, do we want to, let's do a count. Give me I'm short a couple people.
Chair Algauer,
Yes.
Commissioner Higginson,
Yes.
Commissioner Chester,
Yes.
Commissioner Beck,
Yes.
Commissioner Vick.
Yes.
Thank you.
Motion carries. Okay, thank you. Got a project. Ben, do you have any announcements? Or are we gonna have that study session, or what are we doing?
We will have that study session, and so I would respectfully ask if Commissioner Higginson can go grab Donna real quick and bring her back in. And
Oh, you wanna bring it back in? Forgot about her. The only reason I, okay, Ben, you're up. What do we,
All right, so I'm sure this is going to be everyone's favorite discussion that we'll have, but as kind of continuing on from our last meeting, given that we have a number of new commissioners, really this is to provide one kind of an update for existing commissioners, but then information for our new ones, members of the public, and everyone else about some of the different housing laws and really kind of what that means for you guys as decision makers, what it means for us as staff, and really kind of where we go from here. So kind of first things first, we actually have a press release that we had done as part of the housing element, which I had referenced this kind of component, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. One of the key things that everyone kind of needs is, food, water, and shelter. And so housing is kind of a big deal for people because that's one of our most fundamental kind of physiological needs. And so as kind of discussed within the Land Use Planning 101 presentation at the last meeting, really, the land use plans, we're trying to figure out, directing growth, managing the resources that we have, providing for future needs, including housing in it. And so that's where planning and then certainly housing comes together, is managing those different components to figure out, how do we plan for the needs of the future and meet both the current demographics of our community and then certainly those in the future. Now, housing certainly has become a bigger issue as of late. Just for kind of frame reference within the county, minimum wage right now is $15. The affordable rent for that worker, kind of what would be appropriate, is about $728 a month. However, the current rent with a one-bedroom apartment in the county is over $1,100. So there's quite a big disparity between that. And then certainly the average wage kind of needed for a one-bedroom unit to afford that would be $24. So, considerably more than the $15. And then $30 to double what the minimum wage is for a two-bedroom apartment. And so there's a few different key elements that come together with it. This is identified some of in our housing element, but even different committees and commissions have relayed these concerns. One is that the housing production itself has not necessarily kept up with demand, and so housing has become progressively more expensive. And it impacts a few different elements, including many of the community, if they're looking for a new place or a new spot in their lifestyle, can't necessarily afford to live here anymore. And so they either move away from the hometown of Yucaipa or even the state, or in some cases, certainly the homeless crisis is part of some of the housing challenges among other elements. And then one of the elements as well is the economic loss of people leaving. So in prior discussions, let's say for the Economic Development Advisory Committee, they talked about, hey, we have our kids that grew up here, productive members are young professionals, they can't afford to live here, they're moving farther away. And so that engine of growth, the kids going to T-ball, that they have just is, kind of stopping with that. And so that was a concern as well. Now, as kind of response, we've had a lot of changes to housing laws. I do want to note kind of quickly kind of the purpose of this meeting and kind of going from there. One, as much as many like to complain about Sacramento and the status there, is the reality is housing laws themselves isn't necessarily a partisan issue. Both Governor Newsom, but as well as many of the prior Republican candidates, all had platforms dealing with streamlining housing development, encouraging future housing development. And this is also something, as a planner, I follow kind of the national level politics. Red states, blue states, they're all dealing with housing laws and trying to encourage housing development. Each has their own unique approaches, but it isn't a monolithic, one side approaches housing in one way and the other side approaches a different way. It really is just, every different place is looking for ways to deal with the housing costs and that production. And so for our purpose, it really is that there's no kind of silver bullet idea of, you know, hey, if this group or other groups take over of the legislature, we're going to see where the cities can just do what they want. That's not necessarily going to be the case. Further, many different builder groups, housing advocates, and other parties are also interested in improving housing opportunities. So even beyond the political realm, you have all these different stakeholders that are also at the table trying to advocate for housing. And so really the simple takeaway for us as a city, as we apply our housing obligations or projects, is that this is kind of the lay of the land and remain an issue. It may change over time, but it's something that we will certainly have to apply. Additional note, as I kind of talked about these different laws, is remember, I did not write these. I'm merely the messenger of what we have. And really is kind of providing the focus today rather than a critique of laws and what they do well or not well. This is really more just a high-level overview of how does it pertain to us as a collective as we deal with reviewing projects, both bringing it to a planning commission. What do you guys need to know that's important for your decision-making process? And the last part is really, these laws are really complex. Not all of them are written as that well. As I noted, I did not write these laws. All of them have kind of unique features or weird exceptions that kind of play in because they're trying to apply it to a statewide kind of thing. Every jurisdiction has its own unique elements, and so one thing to note, we're not going to go into a deep dive of every single law and what the nuances are, because I could spend many days on that process, and really it isn't necessarily, I think, helpful for us. And then the other components, they're also changing all the time. So by the time you kind of get grapple on maybe what is the density bonus law and what those standards are, next year it's going to be a little different. And so it really is, you know, a high-level discussion that I'm just trying to help equip you guys so that when you guys are reviewing housing-related projects, you kind of know where are the wins at, where are your limitations, where are the opportunities, and really just being able to work within that framework and be able to execute decisions that are appropriate and best for the city. Now, as I noted, housing, certainly in the state of California, among other places, is a big issue. And in response, the state of California has declared a housing crisis that is affecting every community. Over the past several years, the state legislature has also approved a number of different housing laws since 2017. So really, this kind of stretch from 2017 to today has had hundreds of new laws and dozens of new laws being signed every year. And in fact, really kind of since this kind of, later 2010s period, we've seen more laws focused on housing and that process than some of the decades preceding. So it really has become, as that cost and as housing has become a bigger issue, is, okay, the state legislature is really kind of throwing every opportunity they have to try to address it. And so that's what we have. At the state's high-level goals, really there's kind of a few main key components that they're trying to do at a very fundamental level. One is make housing easier to build and remove any potential constraints that impede that ability. Certainly increasing renter protections. And then the kind of last kind of components is increasing the enforcement of the laws too. So there was a lot of rules that had already been on the books, but really wasn't enforced, or let's say the California Department of Housing and Community Development really didn't have a mechanism to say, hey, you were violating this, but we don't have any way to go after you for doing that. And that since change, it really gives them a lot more tools to actually enforce laws that were already on the books. And then really the last part is reinforcing kind of certainty in the planning process, is that if you have properties that are allowed to have housing, the developers or the property owner should kind of know what their rights are on that, and it should be relatively easy and transparent to figure that out.
Ben?
Yes.
What you just said about the housing authority, they're not an enforcing agency supposedly, is that correct?
The Housing and Community Development does have an enforcement mechanism
they do.
as part
So
of their
Is that
department.
just a recent addition to, I didn't think they had any authority for enforcement.
So typically, they'll just refer matters to the state attorney general. And over the years, the state has added things to the list that are enforceable by the attorney general. Just in the this last 2021 legislative session, the state actually set money aside to fund what's, I guess, called the housing police. so that they can be more proactive in enforcement.
And so one thing I do want to note as well, the person that's kind of in charge of that HCD enforcement, she was actually pretty instrumental in helping us get our housing element adopted or certified through the state. So she was kind of that good cop for us on that side, but also very familiar with our housing element on the back end. But that's her new role, is to help facilitate kind of the enforcement of meeting those obligations.
And we'll piggyback on Donna's comment. Would it be similar to our code enforcement? They don't really have law where they can't really arrest anybody, but they can give them a citation, I think. Is that it?
So I'll kind of cover a few of the different elements in terms of enforcement through the presentation, but yeah, it would be either penalties such as fines for that, decertification of the city's housing element and loss of funding that may apply there, and penalties there as well. And then certainly if we do certain activities, then the courts can also invalidate the decision that the Plan Commission did as part of that too, and overturn essentially what the city's decision was if it's inconsistent with what the rules are with the city. And so I'll discuss those kind of with the respective laws down the next 3 or 4 slides. But yeah. So kind of high level, as most of the Plan Commission is well aware of, the general plan really kind of sets forward the housing obligations and kind of that basis. State law does require the general plan to have an adopted housing element that's compliant with state law, and then addresses kind of an 8-year planning cycle. On the right of the screen, you do see the city's RENA requirements. It's 2866 units that we have to try to facilitate over the next 8-year period. Kind of the key driving force of the general plan housing element is the regional housing needs allocation. So the 2866 is our share of the approximately 1.3 million units that were allocated to the entire Southern California region. Now, one of the kind of key laws that has been on the books for a long time, since 1982, is the Housing Accountability Act. It has always been intended to kind of limit the local jurisdiction's ability to deny or make infeasible housing development projects are consistent with their code requirements. And this was something that had been on the books, but had no enforcement capability. So most cities usually took actions that were kind of counter to this law and really didn't have any consequences for it. However, since 2017, that emphasis has really changed and really worked to strengthen this law. One of the elements is SB 167 and AB 78, which documents kind of the standards that are needed in order to deny a project, and then also includes a fine of up to $10,000 per unit that if that standard is not met and the city chooses to deny those units, then that would be fined upon the city. Another element was AB 1515, which is a reasonable person standard of determination for compliance with city standards. So it's not just kind of this arbitrage kind of working through of saying this project does not meet it. It's more of a standard test of you kind of look at it, a plain person can say, yeah, this meets the code requirements or doesn't. And so kind of that legal gymnastics that may have been employed in the past wouldn't pass muster with that law. And then AB 3194 is a zoning consistency kind of requirement. So if there is a inconsistency with what the general plan land use allows and the zoning designation, essentially the general plan takes kind of precedent. So if your zoning code hadn't been updated to match the general plan, then that would be the fault of the jurisdiction. The general plan would kind of cover it. As the city of Yucaipa, since we have a one map system, our general plan and zoning map are the same. We don't have that same issue. But some cities may update the general plan, say this is now the new designation, but their zoning code may not reflect that.
Okay, that just confused me. Explain that again, slower.
Okay, so in many cities except for us and a few others, the general plan map and the zoning map are different. So the general plan is much more broad. It'll say this is like our high density housing area. This is our single family housing. And it'll be very broad brush type stuff. And then they'll have their zoning districts of, let's say, this is our RS 10,000 square foot lot. This is our RS 5,000 square foot lot. This is these different components. And so they'll have these maps kind of separate. And so if you had your general plan map that showed one type of land use, that maybe was more intense and your zoning code map had not been updated yet, then that inconsistency would not be a detriment for the Housing Accountability Act. It would apply that general plan requirement. It doesn't really apply here since we don't have that same framework, but. Okay. And then the last one is SB 330, which is a lot of the elements of what cities cannot do for a housing-related discussion. So a lot of the recent discussion on the Housing Accountability Act really falls under the wheelhouse of SB 330, which I'll cover in the next slide. So SB 330 is kind of referred to as no net loss. This is one of the key no net loss laws, and there'll be another one I'll talk about in some following slides. But really what it does establish is prohibit cities from reducing the capacity of a parcel to less than what was in effect in January 1st, 2018, unless there's a concurrent change elsewhere. So if, let's say, a city wants to downzone a property and say, okay, this property itself was allowed to have 40 units on it, now we're changing it, it will only be allowed to have 20. That 20 has to be upzoned somewhere else in the city to go with that. And so it really addresses kind of those decision-making activities that if you're trying to rezone parcels of land, there is kind of that thought process that, okay, it isn't just a vacuum decision, it does have an impact somewhere else in the city. And then another component was it really does prohibit cities from limiting the amount of housing or population through either moratoriums that are placed on development, limitations on the number of approvals, caps on housing units that may be built, and population limits. And then it also does establish that any low-income units that were demolished have the right of refusal for the new units that are provided or can receive assistance. Really, in terms of the limitations, like the moratoriums, the city of Yucaipa has not had any, but certainly other jurisdictions near us had kind of caps. My experience with the city of Redlands is they had a pretty difficult process for how they allocated housing units, and that has essentially been rendered void with SB 330.
So let me try to, if somebody has got approval for attractive houses anywhere in the city, and instead of building, they sell the property, the new landowner doesn't want to build anything. Those houses that were approved prior, do they now have to be built someplace else in the city? Does that mean no net loss? Because you can't force the landowner to build the houses, correct?
That is correct. So in this case, if they didn't request a rezone that would remove the development capacity, then it wouldn't necessarily trigger SB 330. If they had the entitlement and they just choose not to add on it, it doesn't necessarily deal with SB 330.
So what triggers it then?
If, let's say, the city was to rezone a property. So we had an area of land and we said, okay, we want to change the designation that would remove that unit capacity. So we're going to make it more low density or something of that sort. Then that triggers that change of discussion. There is another law that I'll get into that has kind of a separate component and is the second part of the no net loss laws. No, it's not an easy framework, and so I'll get to that next. Kind of ending on, I got 2 more slides on the Housing Accountability Act, but really kind of key few things that also came into play. One is a streamlined process, so it does limit projects that are consistent with the development code. A total of 5 hearings are allowed on that project, so Plan Commission or City Council or, let's say, a design review board or other entities can't have all these subsequent meetings for a project. It's, once you hit the 5 number, a decision needs to be made or you're in violation as well. And that's part of it, just you can't stall out these projects over a long period of time. City of Yucaipa, we're kind of lucky that we don't have a lot of these kind of miscellaneous committees and commissions that also review that stuff. Some cities have like architectural board and all these other elements that add meetings, and so we don't have that issue. It also does establish certain elements in terms of the timeline for approval after the environmental review period is done, including 90 days after certification of the EIR if there's a project for it, and then it's 60 days if it's about half affordable. And then the last part is kind of the certainty in the process is the unit count itself is based on the density that's permitted by the zoning and general plan. We don't necessarily get to make a judgment call of, well, this area may not be able to have a unit on it, so this shouldn't count against it. That's not how the Housing Accountability Act treats it. It really is just a more, you take what is the yield that's allowed per your code, and then you apply it on the property, and it's a much more black and white type of process. And then kind of the last components are the approval process applies to consistency with objective design standards. So stuff that's subjective, like, hey, they should include, compatible features where there really isn't a clear-cut definition. That cannot be the basis for denial of a project. And then cities themselves are also tasked at the staff level that we have to identify those consistency with objective standards when we deem a project complete or kind of within that period. So we will, before we even route the project out to other departments, we'll know whether or not it's kind of meeting those objective design standards or not. And if it does meet it, then that is ultimately what the city has to consider in its approval process. And then this right here is a easy chart to navigate on how the Housing Accountability Act should be applied. I say that in jest because it's not necessarily very easy, but it is kind of helpful, but really it's making sure that, hey, if the project meets your code requirements, you shouldn't be taking action that runs counter to it. Now, the second part of the no net loss provisions that I wanted to share, and this goes, I think, to your point, Commissioner Snodgrass, is AB 166. And so this is part of the RENA requirement of the housing element. It does require that cities throughout the RENA period maintain the planned capacity. So that 2866 units that we have for the city obligation, we have kind of different areas set that can meet those requirements, and we have to maintain those requirements. And so what that means is essentially a city cannot downzone or approve projects that are at a lower density cited in the housing element unless it provides remaining sites that can do it. So let's say hypothetically in the housing element we say this will provide 100 moderate units, and this is what we expect this property to be able to do as part of our housing sites. Someone shows up as a developer, wants to do 50 units that are moderate. That's great, it meets our code requirements, but then that means that we have to make up those 50 units elsewhere. And so that's where I think to your point, Donna, as the landowner that has an entitlement for something, they choose not to act on it. Some sort of formal action that goes with that could have that implication as well. And really it comes down to is when we do have that transition, it does require then cities to rezone and either make a finding that we have adequate sites, or we have to essentially half a year to rezone sites and then resubmit that to the state. And so we do try to have a little bit of a buffer as part of our affordable housing kind of thresholds. We did include a 15% buffer just to make sure that if one project comes through and is slightly below where we thought it was going to be, we're not scrambling. It gives us a little bit of breathing room, but it is something that is important. And so really this is as part of the greater scheme, both for SB 330 and AB 166, is it does implicate the decision for projects listed as part of a housing element strategy. So the housing element covers, above moderate to affordable housing, and so we have different strategies to meet those different stuff. And so we have to be mindful in the decisions that, is this going to help the strategy or is it going to make it worse? And if it's going to make it worse, then we have to kind of make up for that change. All right, now we get into the more complex laws, because the ones I just talked about are not the complex ones. Density bonus is probably one that is one of the harder ones to get through just because, one, it's very dense, as the name implies, but more importantly, it really is comprised of a lot of different laws that in recent years every year it's been changed a little bit here and there, but just over time has had a lot of different changes throughout that. And so it really does make it kind of complex to follow. There's a lot of little nuances to it that apply. But really at high level, the idea is that in order to offset costs, developers are allowed an increase of units and can get incentives, concessions, or waivers of standards to help provide affordable housing. So it says, okay, if you have a property, your zoning allows you to build, 20 houses, But if you're trying to provide affordable housing, you may not be able to meet that with those 20 units. So you get an escalation of that density to provide affordable housing. The increase itself is based on affordability. So if you have lower income units or more units that are affordable, then that increases the density bonus. And so really kind of the key threshold is up to a 50% increase if either 15% of the units are very low income housing, 24% are low income, or 44% or greater is moderate income. As part of the approval, developers are allowed to submit the density bonus, and then any reductions are requested as part of those objective standards. So if, let's say we have a setback requirement of 25 feet, they can say as part of the concessions that we want to be able to do 20 feet. And so that becomes then the objective standard. The 25 with the reduction is not the standard, it's now the 20 feet that's being requested is the objective design standard. And then one thing to kind of note is while they get to request the density bonus, it doesn't mean it's a freebie and then they can just build something that's at a higher income level. It does establish a long-term covenant. And for the most part, it is at least 55 years that applies to that property. So when you have the affordable housing project, you're going to have that housing need met for a considerable amount of time. As part of the density bonus, so the process that I just talked about is kind of a high level. What does that mean for the plan commissioners? Really, there's a few different elements that come into play that you'll see with it. So the first part is incentives and concessions. This allows a reduction of standards that has kind of a nexus to a reduction of cost of development. So the number of concessions that they can ask for is based on a sliding scale, with more affordable housing projects allowed more concessions than not. And then there's also a additional consideration for those that are low VMT areas. Now itself is the reductions are limited to the reduction of project costs, so they can't just ask for anything. Just for the sake of it, it does have to have some sort of tangible element with the project costs and making the project affordable. However, there is another part of the density bonus, which is called waivers, which is really about removing a standard that permits the density that can be achieved. So rather than maybe necessarily dealing with cost affordability, but let's say there's certain standards that don't allow you to build at your maximum capacity, then the waiver would allow for them to do that. And so there are some cities that have had multifamily standards that really were intentionally designed to never allow you to meet your maximum yield on that. And so essentially this says, hey, the developer can say, hey, I can't meet the maximum yield, so this is the standard I'm going to waiver from, and I'm allowed to do that because I need to be able to meet that threshold. Now, there is a limit that they cannot cause specific adverse impacts on public health, safety or welfare, or cultural resources, and so this is a pretty well-defined component in the density bonus law that those findings need to be addressed. And then kind of the last two elements with the density bonus stuff is that parking is reduced as well, and further reduced if you're near transit, and so cities cannot require additional parking beyond that, but certainly can try to work through that, so that becomes a parking standard. And the last part is more of a fair housing element, is that the units really need to be spread throughout the site, so you can't have your affordable housing project where you have kind of the slum building versus the rest of the project. It really needs to be intermixed, and so it doesn't seem like, hey, this is where the poor people, like that's part of that, and for good reason as well, but just something that to keep in mind as well, and especially as we as staff review these different projects, is making sure that it's pretty uniform and fair through that project. Now, this is another fun law. Luckily, the city of Yucaipa has not had to deal with this yet, but this is applicable to the city in that any city or county that has not met its RENA requirements or is not on pace with the RENA is subject to SB 35. What this does is it does create a streamlined by right process for affordable housing multifamily projects. A few key elements is it does require compliance with objective design standards. But one thing to keep in mind is that the density bonus does provide those waivers and incentives, so it's not there is that flexibility baked in. And then one of the unique elements is it does require prevailing wage construction, and then it cannot demolish any existing affordable units. Now I'm going to get into kind of different housing strategies and laws that come into play. I'm sure as most of the commissioners have heard about is accessory dwelling units, or kind of the grading flats on properties. These are small rentable units on property. These are allowed in any zone that allows residential units. Does include reduced fees and ministerial approvals for these type of structures, including essentially allowing for any 800 square foot detached ADU that can be built 4 feet from the side and rear property line. And then as part of the single family lots, it does allow both a ADU and then a junior ADU, which is down by a small 500 or less square foot within an existing building footprint. The ADUs, certainly when they came out and became part of law, generated a lot of concern with different communities. However, in its implementation, it really hasn't had a lot of concerns, especially in Yucaipa. It is a kind of small incremental approach for affordable housing. So rather than this large affordable housing, apartment project, it's more of a spattering of small units coming into fruition. And it does give opportunities for property owners to have kind of rentable units. We do have a few different ADUs where we've surveyed the property owners. They say this helps pay my mortgage. I have a great tenant back there, and it really has been pretty benign in our experience. And so I think everyone that's built an ADU in Yucaipa has actually relayed that they love it. And so that's just something to note as well as part of the city's experience with these type structures. Now, another fun law that is has not been employed in the city of Yucaipa yet, but we have had discussions with it, is SB 9, which is kind of governing both second units and urban lot splits. Really, one thing I do want to note, just because there's been a lot of, I think, misinformation, the applicability for SB 9 is the parcel subject to the proposed housing development is located within a city, the boundaries of which include some portion of either an urbanized area or urban cluster as designated by the United States Census Bureau. So I had emphasized a few components, which is the within a city and includes some portions of either an urbanized area or cluster. And so there's been some public comment I've heard or some videos where people have said it does not apply to parts of the city. And really the statement that's being applied is those that are unincorporated communities that are a rural kind of cluster per the census. City of Yucaipa is considered an urbanized area pursuant to the Census Bureau. And so even though we may have some areas of the city that are not, because a property is within the city, it is subject to SB 9. And so I just want to make sure that that is cleared, given that there's been some competing statements out there, and want to make sure that everyone is familiar with that requirement. SB 9 does apply to Yucaipa, yes. If we were like Running Springs, where it's an unincorporated rural community, it would not apply. But in that law provision for unincorporated communities, a place like Bloomington would be subject to SB 9. But because Yucaipa is a incorporated city, all the parcels are subject to SB 9. That is correct. Now, in terms of SB 9, it actually covers kind of two different components. One is urban lot splits. It allows, essentially, if you have a property with a lot of kind of vacant land in the back, it does allow for a split of that. There are some components to it. It does require that the urban lot split is at least 40% of the original lot and at least 1,200 square feet. So if you had a really small lot, you really couldn't subdivide it. Or if it's like, hey, I have a lot of stuff on my lot and I want this little sliver in the back, that doesn't work either. It has to be kind of a fair split between the lots with it. And then SB 9 also includes second units, which does allow owners to build a second unit on their property through SB 9. And then it does establish a parking limit requirement for those outside major transit areas. I did want to show, just in terms of kind of a counterpoint to SB 9, the picture on the slide is a historic home that has 2 units on it. If you're familiar with, let's say, some of the historic neighborhoods in Redlands, some of those houses are 2 units as well. So it isn't necessarily a foreign concept to see houses with this, but certainly we'll want to make sure it's designed well. Storage structures kind of have a nice kind of mass and design that lend itself where that balance is pretty minimized, and so cities can develop objective standards that help. If someone were to do something like this, it doesn't look too tacked on, but really more integrated with the design, and from the outside appearance does kind of fit in with that character. I don't remember. I think there is building setback requirements, but I'll defer to the legal counsel.
So the bill requires that any application for an SB 9 just be sufficient enough to allow for the separate conveyance of the properties. So there are instances where a shared wall could potentially satisfy that requirement. A lot of local agencies, because there is still some room to develop your own objective standards to sort of mold the development into a fashion that's compatible with the city and the different single-family areas within the city. Some cities have put restrictions on those types of things. Some cities have encouraged those types of things. It's really, there's a lot of variation at this point with regards to what the developments actually look like.
Yeah, just curious, if you had a 6,000 square foot lot, you split it right down the middle and can make a fourplex on that with a shared wall, 0 setback in the center.
Potentially, provided that the local ordinance, because the thing is there's a 4-foot setback that the city is allowed to enforce, but it doesn't mean that the city can't be more accommodating on that setback and actually make it smaller. So, I haven't looked at the ordinance, the urgency ordinance that's on the books right now for Yucaipa, but I'm assuming that we have a 4-foot
Yeah, we
setback?
have what the state allows.
Yeah, so it wouldn't necessarily be allowed in the city of Yucaipa if the ordinance itself provides for the 4-foot setback.
But that
I
was-
don't know if I made that.
No, it's great.
Okay.
Yeah, without some kind of special use or, I don't know what you'd call it. If you'd set aside that 4 feet for that project, that's the only way it'd be done.
Right, so the state, because it is a state mandate and there's
Right.
certain requirements set forth in the state law that the city's required to approve certain projects that meet those standards. But that being said, there is certain room for deviation. It's just very limited in terms of the number of ways the city can deviate from the state standards. But one of the permissible ways to deviate from the state standards is to allow a smaller setback. So in those instances, if you are in a jurisdiction that has allowed for a smaller setback other than the 4-foot, you may see something more along the lines of what you described.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, usually these laws gives you kind of what the limit of what you have to allow, and then cities can be more forgiving on that. Our SB 9 urgency ordinance tried to really strike the line of encouraging good design, and we will be bringing a permanent ordinance sometime this year, but really kind of working through, as I mentioned, with the historic building kind of example is where it, from outward appearances, still resembles that single-family home versus a bunch of fourplexes kind of cobbled together on properties.
But what a question on that Lyle brought up was, okay, if I have a 10,000 square foot lot, well, I want to divide it in half, so I have 2 5,000 square foot, but the zoning is 10,000 square foot lots. The zoning map. So how do you, so we gonna throw the zoning map out?
If it was a SB 9 application, they would be allowed to proceed with that. And so one of the things I do want to note, just as part of that, is it does establish kind of a 3-year owner occupancy intent requirement. And so like a developer that had, let's say, a subdivision, they were going to do 10,000 square foot lots, couldn't just wave their wand and say, I'm going to do SB 9, 5,000 square foot lots. It would have to be the future owner of that property and them committing to it. So it isn't going to be as broad brush, but it would certainly be something that individual property owners could pursue pursuant to state law.
It's not allowable for developers to pursue that SB 9 per,
Well, there's certain requirements that were put in the bill sort of last minute because a lot of groups had concerns that developers would be able to go in and sort of circumvent the Subdivision Map Act. So what is in the bill that sort of curtails a developer's ability to do that is there's one requirement that prevents the same individual from, or I should say the same individual and anyone acting in concert with that individual from splitting adjacent lots. And then there's also the owner occupancy affidavit required for the lot splits.
You have to be resident for 2 years on one of those 3 years?
But that being said, in application, it isn't entirely clear at this point how developers will sort of leverage certain holes that are in the bill. The bill itself, it isn't the cleanest bill to come out of Sacramento. I would imagine that we're going to get some sort of cleanup legislation in the upcoming years. But as of right now, there hasn't been, and mind you, it's March 1st, 2023, but there hasn't been a significant manipulation of it by developers because of those requirements that are in the bill.
One kind of interesting case of that, I am familiar with a developer who contacts homeowners and offers their services for a subdivision for free when they could recuperate the cost of that on the back end after the lot was sold. And so that's allowed as long as it's initiated by the homeowner. But a large portion of it is that it's, a lot of homeowners don't really want to have a much smaller lot that they're then sharing as well, so.
Subjective opinion. I mean, once
back
prices
up
of
then,
homes
or
go up and people need to afford their mortgages, if this exponential increase of home prices continues to grow, this is gonna become more and more attractive.
Yeah, and I do think, based on even before SB 9 was on the books, or kind of move it through, I would receive calls from property owners that had kind of larger lots where they had a large back area that they really were responsible for just like mowing to avoid weed abatement notices. And they would say, hey, what can I do to subdivide this? It doesn't meet the minimum lot size. And so they'd go, I wish there was an alternative to get there. And so we did receive those calls, not very frequently, but enough to note that when SB 9 came through, it's like those would be probably the property owners that you would see doing the urban lot splits.
You could see rural communities being the most effective because we're still the communities that possess lot sizes large enough to accommodate these type of
Yeah, and be
SB
able to
9.
provide that kind of,
Right.
that at least 40% similar lot sizes
Right,
between.
And Commissioner Vick, to your point, it's a good point. There's something called the Turner Center for Housing Policy. It's out of UC Berkeley, and they've sort of taken a look to see where most of the development, the SB 9 development, is occurring at. And they did say that it is in the areas that have the lot sizes that are large enough to accommodate the splits.
Yeah.
I have a question. Do they ever consider water? Like when they're subdividing, like do they consider, is there going to be enough sewage, water flow? I mean, do they think about those things when they're subdividing? I don't know.
There are, I think, limitations on it. Generally, at a very high level, density or more density usually results in per capita reduction of water usage, but certainly that is, certain communities suffer more from that. Those limitations are closer to the brink, and so that's certainly part of the overall contentiousness of SB 9 and how it impacts different jurisdictions kind of along that front, so.
Okay.
All right, so now I'm gonna get into some other types of laws. So there has been a push as well to allow kind of residential units on commercial properties. There's kind of two different ones in place. One is AB 211, which does allow a ministerial approval for multifamily developments on commercial zone properties. Does include two requirements. One is prevailing wage requirements, and that also requires that units be below market rate, so it does require kind of affordable housing targets. And then there's another law, that's SB 6, which allows potentially discretionary permits for multifamily housing. But as part of it, it does not require the affordable target, but it does establish both prevailing wage and skilled and trained workforce requirements, and so it does have its own set of kind of limitations. Both of them do have a number of different performance requirements that make them a little bit more difficult in practice. I do want to note, however, the city's housing element does include a commercial corridor overlay between 2nd and 14th Street to allow kind of mixed-use development. Part of it is the commercial sector's changed quite a bit, and so as a way to help meet some of the more affordable housing criteria, City Council did approve the overlay, and the standards will be coming. And really, the goal is to make it much more simplified. So rather than some of the bureaucraticness that goes into the state law requirements, is really to set higher standards and expectations, but really make it a much more streamlined process for all those involved. I did want to ask if, looking at this project, this is a project that was approved, if anyone wants to take a quick guess of what they think the density is of this. Not in town.
Looks like Riverside.
RL1.
R1. So this is a 3-story apartment project and commercial. This is 53 units per acre.
Wow.
Is the density. This was in Grover Beach, a friend of mine did. But something that in terms of that building mass is, you don't notice that density kind of all on there. All right. And then we're going to get into a few more housing laws. This is one that was unique and really impacted the housing element. And really something that isn't necessarily going to apply too much to the Plan Commission right now, but something to keep in the back of your head, is AB 1397. It did require cities, as we establish our housing sites, kind of inventory, especially for the housing, affordable housing sites, it does require parcels to provide the accessible infrastructure to serve those units. And really, this law was addressed in the paper sites that cities would establish. So they would say, this is where we're going to have affordable housing. However, you can't build on it because there's no utilities there. There's no access there. You're going to spend, $50 million to be able to even put a shovel in the ground. And so it was really kind of saying, okay, yeah, you guys said you could build on this site, but it really can't. And so the state really did provide a much more comprehensive set of requirements for affordable housing sites. And it essentially determines kind of what those are presumed infeasible unless the city can demonstrate otherwise, if there are certain impediments. And really, it's one of the things that's important for the Planning Commission is if we have these certain kind of affordable housing sites identified in the general plan, if the next housing element comes through in 8 years, we're looking at it. If these sites remain vacant, the state's going to start asking, okay, so why are these not being built? And so it does lend itself to the city trying to have to prove some of these sites and the ability to develop. And really, if it kind of the state views it as, okay, these really don't have a chance in hell, for lack of a better term, of being developed, then we have to find a new site to replace that one instead. And so it's just something to keep in mind that as we kind of select these different housing strategies, is we need to be working to make sure that they come to fruition. Otherwise, they get dropped off as being infeasible. And one of the things that's important to keep in mind as well with the other state laws is if, let's say, okay, this site is zoned for 400 units, we thought it was going to be affordable, it never gets built, the state says this doesn't count anymore, you need to make up that unit somewhere else, is okay, then you still have this on the books. And so that change you have to be mindful of as well. And then kind of the last kind of component of different laws that are also important is just fair housing components. This really comes down to discrimination of individuals for a variety of different reasons, both at the federal and state kind of definitions of that, and making sure that when we are planning for housing or reviewing housing projects or discussing housing projects, that we're making sure that we're not running afoul of fair housing requirements. Really, one of the things that comes into fruition, especially with the planning and zoning law, as it does invalidate decisions if the city kind of denies housing projects based on protected status or other sort of discriminatory things, then that can also play into whether or not the city's decision is upheld or not. And one of the things that's, I think, important, less more, I think, for the plan commissioners themselves, but even as part of the public comments that we receive, is being mindful of the dialogue that is used. Sometimes discriminatory language is inadvertently applied. Those people, sometimes innocuous type of stuff that can inadvertently impact the validity of the decision-making process. Sometimes it's, very outward. Certainly, those of us in our career have received concerns from neighbors that really was inappropriate language at times, but sometimes it's much more subtle, and just something to keep in mind that if you hear that discussion, as making sure that when you're making the decision that you're kind of clarifying that this is the reason for the decision and it's not based on a discriminatory basis. And then kind of a part of that with the housing element itself, also required analysis of fair housing. This is AB 686 that require analysis of fair housing in the housing elements. It really kind of assesses what is the current state of housing and the fairness of it, policy and programs that impede fair housing, and proactive goals and policies that affirmatively further fair housing. So think of it as cities where you've heard the term like the other side of the tracks or something of that sort, where you have this kind of area of the community that's more disparately low income or impoverished, and therefore is as making sure that then your housing elements addressing policies that can address that issue and doesn't further exacerbate those problems. The benefit itself with the city of Yucaipa is we really don't have that type of fair housing issue. We don't have a spot in the community where it is, this is the very disparately impacted area. We really don't have those issues. Really, the spots where we do have some of the lower cost housing or lower amenity features really were disadvantaged through infrastructure issues. So they were in flood zones where it limited the development capacity or the ability to obtain insurance or other elements that resulted in impacts to those. And the city itself, through past city councils and management, had really kind of prioritized those capital improvement projects. We've done a number of flood control projects that those properties that were historically in flood zone couldn't be expanded upon, really had limitations and were expensive to maintain insurance with. Those have been pulled out, and so that's an element that the city's done to remove those impediments. A number of the different programs like the Safe Routes to School to add sidewalks to neighborhoods, adding lighting, adding features, our facade enhancement program, all those address some of the areas that were a little bit more disadvantaged and trying to bring those up. And so those policies are really both by the state recognized as being good actions that the city's done, but then even for the community really is addressing those historic inequities and trying to make sure that all of our residents have a safe place to live and address those. And so really we've done a lot to improve those conditions, but we always need to be mindful that we're taking kind of a fair and balanced approach on how we're delegating housing or viewing housing projects and trying to make sure that we're supporting those efforts and improving the quality of life for all our residents. Kind of a few other elements with the state law really is timelines. Time is money. The cost to develop, as you string stuff along, impact stuff. And so there has been, as part of law, Permit Streamlining Act that governs key milestones that the city has to do. So once we've deemed a project complete, routed it for review, there are timelines that we need to meet. We can't just kind of hold on a project and kind of let the clock run out. We really do want to make sure that we're keeping stuff moving. And certainly as a customer service component, we don't want to be the slow city either, and we don't have that reputation as a benefit as well. But new laws have come into play that also further specify timelines. So SB 330, as I mentioned, does cover a more streamlined housing project. So timeline, so the 5 meetings as an example is one of those components where it's like, hey, it can't be this drawn out process. If it meets your requirements, you gotta get it through, provide that facility. And then the last part is AB 2234, which now also addresses kind of the post-entitlement approval. So if someone has got their, tentative map, they've subdivided the property, they're building their housing units, is when they're submitting the building plans for that. Is if it's going through the review, they've provided everything, they meet the code requirements, we can't be sitting on those building permits either. And so it does establish that timeline as well. Yep.
Is SB 9 and the ADUs also subject to that expeditiousness of permitting and processing?
That they are, especially with the ADUs, there are specific timelines called out in those laws that further address it.
It's a 60-day timeline, right?
Yeah, something like that, and there's some components. The benefit we do have, so like even with this law here, the post-entitlement approvals, our standard turnaround time for plan review is quite a bit shorter than what's required by state law. And so we have a pretty high success rate of meeting those turnarounds for all building permits in the city. And so certainly that applies there as well. But it is important to keep in mind that, you know, from start to finish is the state wants to make sure that we're not dragging our feet on these projects. And then this kind of comes into HCD enforcement. So as I kind of talked about, the state is looking at what we're doing. HCD is monitoring, and so they can send letters inquiring about the progress of programs to achieve compliance. One of the key elements is our annual progress report. So every year before April 1st, we have to submit an annual progress report to the state on the housing element progress. And so they look at the number of units that have been built, the number of units entitled, as well as our general plan policies, and say, okay, what have you guys done to meet this program? Or are you on track? Are you falling behind? And making sure that we're doing it. And part of it is, you know, HCD views the housing element as a contract from the city of what we're going to do. So we've adopted this general plan policy that we're going to facilitate housing in these different ways. And so the state's going, okay, you said you're going to do this, you need to do this. And so that's where that enforcement kind of comes through. And then as part of it, the annual progress report, Maddie is having a blast working on it. It is a very, very difficult report with a lot of different timelines. And this is tracking kind of the post, both the entitlement and post-entitlement. So she is tracking down, you know, every project that gets turned in, you know, when is it turned in? When is it routed? When is it decided upon by the decision makers? What is the change of units? Was it affordable? Was it not? And then same with the building permit process. So it was entitled here, then they submitted building permits here. When was the permit issued? When were they finalized? And so the state's trying to both keep track of kind of what the timelines are, what's impacting that, but then also kind of looking if we're disparately longer than everyone else, and they go, okay, that's probably a red flag of a process or procedural breakdown that a city has compared to its neighbors that shouldn't be in place. And so that also can be something to there. A few different components that are really kind of important for us to keep in mind. One is revocation of our housing element. It does allow HCD to revoke the compliance and refer violations to the Attorney General. As I mentioned, we can also be fined for the units that we failed to approve. And then if in particular cases, if we are bad actors, so we're deliberately, you know, just trying to be bad about our housing approvals, that fine goes from $10,000 per unit to $50,000 per unit. So we want to make sure that we're not being arbitrary and capricious in our decision-making process. And the last part is, you know, in addition to HCD going after the city, is developers and other groups will also sue for violations that the city does. And they have been doing it, and they've been pretty vocal about it, is, you know, hey, we're supposed to be doing this. The state is kind of, you know, the big brother looking at this, but there are other members of the community that are also trying to make sure that we're upholding what we said we were going to do. And so it isn't just the state that's concerned about this. There's other groups that are concerned about how cities are taking their decisions and whether or not they're applying their codes appropriately, or trying to implement their general plan, or trying to just be, you know, just being difficult and difficult to work with. So now, what does this mean? Where do we go from here? Kind of a lot of it comes down to, I always try to view things in different perspectives, is consistency and transparency are really the key components. Is we set the rules, and we have to make sure that we're setting the decisions that follow those rules. The thing that we do have to also remember, and one of the things that we, in the state, despite some of the concerns that's happening at the legislature level, is we still do have a lot of control about the shape and form that is there. So the state says we gotta approve so much housing units. The general plan says you're allowed to build this. We gotta make decisions on it, but doesn't say what that has to look like. Cities have control over creating design standards. Other states don't even allow that. Cities don't have that control. but the city does, but it comes down to objective standards. So it really is saying, okay, what do we want to see? And so it is important to think about creating policies that encourage the development we want to see rather than trying to fight the ones that we don't. And so if we have standards that say, this is what we want to see, this is our expectation, you meet all these requirements and you're good to go, that's a lot easier to facilitate versus, man, this project looks ugly, but we don't have any ways to deny it. And so we're going to play this kind of legal, effort to juggle ourselves into dealing with that project. And so it's important to remember that. And the last part is remembering that density is also only a number. Design is important as well. For example, this is a very cute cottage development. This is a higher density project. And so it isn't necessarily, the design really makes a big difference on the livability of projects. And so that's something that I personally value, but is something to help manage if we have to build some of these different units, is to remember that we can kind of set the stage for, we want stuff that looks nice, provides good amenities, and really kind of facilitating that process. And the last part is streamlining the process. We want to, as civil servants, provide good customer service and make sure we're meeting those stuff. And so making sure that the process and timeliness of development is appropriate. And then the last part is kind of remembering, as difficult as affordable housing is to develop and some of those high thresholds, state law really has reiterated that housing for all income levels is important. So our focus isn't just how do we provide affordable housing, it's how do we provide housing for all levels, and how do we meet, at the end of the day, what the community needs are as well. And so just something to keep in mind as part of the decision-making process. Happy to answer any more questions, but I just wanted to give you guys kind of a high-level discussion about all of the fun stuff that you guys get to partake in as decision makers, but there's a lot on the laws that we, as part of our review for every project, is also going through, and it's we do our best with it. It's always changing, and so yeah, that's.
Right now, I think you did a good job. I appreciate, you taking the time to put that together. So really, and it was, I'm sure quite a few of us got something out of it. And that's anytime you can get something out of it, then you're doing good. So with that, Commissioners, anyone have any statements? If not, Ben, when's our next meeting? You got any announcements?
I do have, I thought I written down another announcement, but so we do have a meeting on the 15th. It will be probably a heavily attended one, so be prepared for a fun night. And then I know that both Commissioner Higginson and Snodgrass had indicated interest in doing the Planning Commissioners Academy. Right now, we are on the wait list. They found out that having the first meeting back in person ended up being a lot more popular than they thought. So we are like number 4, 5, and 6 on that. And so they're trying to get some more convention space so that they can open up for more people. As soon as I hear back, I will let you guys know, but I'm hopeful.
What were the dates on that again?
What?
What was the date on that?
It was right before or during the rodeo.
Well, that was rude.
Yeah. I think they didn't want you there. I think that's.
Oh, thanks. Now we're getting personal.
I'm just kidding. But so I'm hopeful. It sounded like they were surprised by the interest, and so they booked up really fast. But I will let everyone know on that. Yeah, March 29th to March 31st is the dates for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But before we go, I just want to give a personal thank you to both Kim and Maria for helping me through. I messed up my Form 700, and they went back to Form 700 101 and helped me fix that and get it up to Sacramento. So thank you to your staff for having the patience of Job in dealing with me on that.
Yeah, no problem. We're glad you're here. It's good. Yeah, it's always a computer glitch now. With that, that's it. Any other?
Yeah, so I realized the one announcement or question I wanted to ask.
Christian's leaving? What'd you say? Oh, no. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
As part of our packet distribution, I know we've been giving you guys hard copies, wanted to see if any of the commissioners would prefer just the digital copy, if you guys have capability for that. Just want to make sure that we're mirroring needs, but if you're like, hey, I don't want all these papers, but I have my laptop, if that's something you guys are interested in, let me know and we can.
It's hard to answer, because something as small as what Dan presented the last time we were here is pretty easy to look at, but when the scope of work on this next meeting is gonna be pretty huge, I think a full set of plans is gonna be.
I just want to make sure, I know that as part of the packets, city council, for example, has assigned iPads, so they're able to have that technology that's provided by the city, but that isn't something that's available for
And then
planning commissioners, so.
commissioners, keep in mind that when you get your packet, if there's something in there, it's like, man, I don't get this. Ben's always available. You know, give Ben a call and he's really good about going through it, and don't be embarrassed to ask.
Yep. I'm here to make sure that you guys are comfortable making the decisions that you guys need to make, and so I am always.
Yeah, the only stupid question is the one you don't ask.
Okay. And that's all I got. I thank you
All right,
guys.
and nothing else. Thank you, commissioners, and meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
I gotta get out of here. Hurry, here she comes.